The year 1995 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of television, we were first introduced to Goosebumps. In sports, Michael Jordan would return to the court, and in the world of wrestling, WCW were formally lighting the fires of the Monday Night Wars by debuting their weekly primetime show, Nitro. However, when it came to the WWF, there were very few positives to be found as, over the next 12 months, they would go through arguably their worst year ever. Yes, the WWF in '95 has become notorious amongst longtime fans as being terrible. However, that's not to say it's not without its charm, with some of the wackiest gimmicks in wrestling history being introduced at this time. So, how did it all unfold? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1995, a year in review. Of course, when we last left off, things were looking positive. Diesel had just been crowned the new WWF champion, and Shawn Michaels' rise to the top of the main event scene was continuing at a fast pace. That said, there were also a lot of negatives as, despite overwhelming audience support for his work, Bret Hart seemed to have been dropped from his position as the company's top babyface, something which left a sour taste in many fans' mouths. And this negativity would only grow when, at the first big show of the year on January 22nd, the Royal Rumble, WWF would put on one of the weakest Rumble matches up until that point, with them making the odd decision here to have a new entrant come in every 1 minute instead of 2, leading to the whole thing being over before it felt like it had gotten started. But before we would get here, the undercard would see Razor Ramon losing his Intercontinental title to Jeff Jarrett, and The Undertaker continue his seemingly endless feud with Ted DiBiase when he was able to make short work of his million-dollar corporation lackey, Irwin R. Shyster. After that, however, things would get more interesting as, in the finals of a tournament to crown new WWF Tag Team Champions after Diesel and Shawn Michaels' split had left the belts vacant, Bob Holly and the 1-2-3 Kid would team up to take on Bam Bam Bigelow and Tatanka, with the former duo ending up getting the win here to crown themselves the new top team in the company. And after the match, Bam Bam would find himself being mocked by former New York Giants star Lawrence Taylor, something which led to the Beast from the East losing his cool and trying to get into a kayfabe shoving match with a celebrity guest. But WWF officials were quick to calm things down and move on from there, as the first of two main events would see Diesel defend his newly won WWF title against the man who had been screwed out of it in the first place, Bret Hart. That said, this was no redemption story for the Hitman because, on this night, his role was to put the new champion over strong, something he did in typical professional fashion, even if it was already clear amongst a section of the fan base that they'd rather see him still on top. So it was lucky then that the fans would get something they wanted in the final bout of the night, because in the Royal Rumble itself, Shawn Michaels and the British Bulldog would enter at numbers 1 and 2 respectively, with each going coast to coast from there as they powered through one of the worst Rumbles in memory, only to end up being the final two remaining after everyone else was eliminated. After that, it appeared that the Bulldog had managed to eliminate HBK, but with only one foot having hit the floor, the Texan was able to get back in the ring to dump out his opponent, winning the whole thing and booking his ticket to WrestleMania 11 as another celebrity guest, Pamela Anderson, was there to celebrate by his side. Yes, it seemed like the long-awaited showdown between Shawn and Diesel was going to happen at the biggest stage possible. But before we would get there, the tag titles would change hands once more when, the night after the Rumble on Raw, the Smoking Guns would defeat Bob Holly and the 1-2-3 Kid to end their reign after just one day. And come WrestleMania on April 3rd, they'd still be holding these belts as they tried their best to give some wrestling focus to a show that was almost entirely built around celebrity involvement. Of course, celebs at the biggest show of the year was nothing new for WWF as they'd originally built it on the backs of people like Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper. This year, though, it felt like, with such little confidence in the roster he had, Vince McMahon was putting every ounce of attention he had to the outside stars he'd brought in instead, to the point where it became a detriment to the show. Yes, this was one that could challenge WrestleMania 9 for the position of worst Mania ever, with the undercard seeing Razor Ramon regain his Intercontinental title from Jeff Jarrett in a pretty nothing match, Owen Hart and Yokozuna team for the first time to win the tag titles from the Smoking Guns, and The Undertaker go 4-0 after beating another Ted DiBiase lackey in King Kong Bundy. Following this, Bret Hart would have arguably the worst match of his career when he faced off against Bob Backlund again in a submission match. Unlike their prior meeting at the 1994 Survivor Series, however, this one was marred by a scenery-chewing Roddy Piper acting as the special guest referee, leading the whole thing to quickly fall apart and stink out the joint. Then, not main eventing the show, Diesel, with Pamela Anderson by his side, would successfully defend his WWF title against Shawn Michaels, who himself would come to the ring with Jenny McCarthy. And after putting on such an impressive performance during this match, HBK would end up completely overshadowing the champion, effectively turning himself babyface, and the reason he hadn't main evented that night was because, instead, Vince McMahon had chosen to go with Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow, a move that was supposed to draw a lot of mainstream attention but ended up doing little to help the lack of interest in his product and only served to undermine the importance of the show, especially after the football star would have defeated Bam Bam come the end of it. So with his plan to gain mainstream eyeballs failing, the boss would try something else, as on May 14th, he would put on the first ever In Your House show, a lower-priced pay-per-view offering that was supposed to act as a buffer in between the bigger shows of the year. And this inaugural edition would see Bret Hart continue to prove that he was the best in the world when he had a hugely underrated match with Hakushi, all before later that night continuing his feud with Jerry Lawler when he ultimately lost to the King once again. After that, Owen Hart and Yokozuna would once again defend their tag team titles against the Smoking Guns, while in the main event of the night, Diesel would fend off his first challenger in the form of a recently returned Psycho Sid, and things wouldn't get much better the next month at the King of the Ring as, after holding their now annual Hall of Fame the night prior, one which saw the likes of Pedro Morales, Big Cat Ernie Ladd, George the Animal Steele, and the Fabulous Moolah be inducted, WWF would put on one of the worst pay-per-views of all time when, in front of a very vocal Philadelphia crowd, Bret Hart would work a pretty awful Kiss My Foot match against Jerry Lawler, all while the main event would see Diesel and Bam Bam Bigelow defeat Psycho Sid and Tatanka in a bout no one could have cared about if they'd tried. But that wasn't even the worst part of the night as, after going through The Undertaker in a prior round, Mabel would defeat Savio Vega to become the King of the Ring in a decision that was wildly rejected by the fans in attendance, most of whom took to chanting for ECW instead as the new king was being crowned. So you'd think that, hearing the reaction to this, Vince McMahon would have made some changes, but no, he would push on with his planned SummerSlam main event of Diesel versus Mabel regardless, a match no one wanted to see. Before that though, In Your House 2, The Lumberjacks would be held on July 23rd, and that would see the final appearances of Jeff Jarrett and the Roadie during the period as, after the former lost his Intercontinental title to Shawn Michaels and the latter picked up a win over the 1-2-3 Kid, they would each quit the company following a contract dispute, putting a stopper on the planned feud between the two going forward. Elsewhere, the boss would continue to build Mabel as a top challenger by having Men on a Mission defeat Razor Ramon and Savio Vega in a tag team match, all while, in the main event of the night, Diesel was defending the WWF title against Psycho Sid in a lumberjack match. And that would all ultimately lead us to SummerSlam on August 27th, where in an attempt to put on a show that would bring audiences back into the fold, Vince McMahon had almost every title be on the line, as Alundra Blaze, who had won the women's strap back from Bull Nakano on the April 3rd episode of Raw, would defend against Bertha Faye, ultimately falling to her here as a new champion was crowned. Following this, two notable newcomers would be introduced to pay-per-view audiences, as Hunter Hearst Helmsley would defeat Bob Holly, and Sunny would accompany her man Skip to the ring as he went on to lose to Barry Horowitz. Meanwhile, The Undertaker's feud with the $1 Million Corporation would continue when he faced off against Kama in a casket match, the very same man who had stolen his mystical urn following WrestleMania 11 and had supposedly then melted it down to form a gold chain, which he took to wearing around his neck. Yes, it was a pretty bad story, and unluckily for fans, the match wouldn't fare much better, as despite their best efforts, the two wouldn't be able to do anything with the gimmick, leaving the Dead Man to mercifully end both the bout and the feud as a whole with a victory after just over 16 minutes. After that, things would get even worse when Bret Hart continued his program with Jerry Lawler by taking on the King's personal dentist, Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS, an early gimmick for Glenn Jacobs that's best left forgotten. So thank God then that the Clique would put something worth watching next, as in the semi-main event, Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon would replay their ladder match from WrestleMania 10, this time putting on yet another classic as, come the end of it, it would be HBK who came out on top, solidifying himself once more as Intercontinental Champion in the process. Unfortunately though, the main event wouldn't be able to match up to this, as there, Diesel would successfully defend against Mabel in one of the worst bouts in WWF history, a meeting so bad that it almost left the champion injured for real after the challenger dropped himself full force on his back. And this almost led to him getting fired after things were done, in fact, with Diesel ending up having to talk Vince McMahon out of doing this in the end. But if the boss thought this would be the only headache he had to deal with at this time, he was very wrong, as only a week after this, on September 4th, WCW would debut Monday Nitro, their weekly answer to Raw that aired live on TNT. And in a move that would set the tone for what was to come, on that very debut episode of Nitro, Lex Luger, who had been under WWF contract until days before, would jump ship, something which no one inside of Vince McMahon's inner circle knew was coming ahead of time. And to make matters worse, back in the WWF, the boss was having to deal with not only a series of terrible failed gimmicks such as Mantar, Fantasio, and Techno Team 2000, but also the increasing problem of the Clique, as, with Triple H now having made his way to the company, he would become the fifth and final member of the backstage power group that also included Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Razor Ramon, and the 1-2-3 Kid. So from there, with their ranks now full, the Clique would make life a living hell for anyone they didn't like, seeming to be the real ones in charge at various points as Vince struggled to corral his top stars into doing what he wanted. But try as he might, they always seemed to get what their hearts desired, something that would become apparent on screen at the next big show of the year, In Your House 3, triple header on September 24th. Yes, it was there that the company promised that every male title the company had would be on the line in the same match, as the tag team champions Owen Hart and Yokozuna took on the newly reformed HBK and Diesel, with them still holding the Intercontinental and World titles respectively. And during that match, two dudes with attitude, as they would become known, would end up getting the win, seemingly taking all the gold home for themselves in that moment. Elsewhere, meanwhile, in a series of nothing bouts, the rest of the card would see Bret Hart continue to dwell in the upper mid-card as he picked up a submission win over Jean-Pierre Lafitte, a feud which had started after the French-Canadian heel stole the Hitman's jacket. On top of this, Dean Douglas would defeat Razor Ramon, the British Bulldog would pick up a win over Bam Bam Bigelow, and Psycho Sid would reign victorious over Henry O. Godwin in a sign that, despite their desire to put on more pay-per-views every year, WWF hadn't quite figured out how to build enough big-time matches so as to accommodate for this. But at least fans had seen a big title change. Well, that's what they thought at least, up until it was revealed that, the next night on Raw, due to a controversial finish that saw the legal man not be pinned in the end, the whole result was to be thrown out and everyone would keep their belts going forward, something which left the audience who'd paid for the show feeling shortchanged. And it wasn't as if the company had any plans for Owen and Yokozuna going forward anyway, because later that same night on Raw, they'd drop the titles to the Smoking Guns as Billy and Bart started their own reign on top. So maybe the next pay-per-view, In Your House 4 Great White North, held on October 22nd, would fare better. Well, fans certainly hoped for this to be the case ahead of time, it would ultimately be even less well received as, in the main event of the night, Diesel and the British Bulldog would have a match so bad that it would finally force Vince McMahon to realize the whole Kevin Nash experiment wasn't working, and so make plans to go with someone new on top instead. And prior to this, things wouldn't be much better as, in a largely irrelevant undercard, the Smoking Guns would defend their tag team titles they recently won from Owen Hart and Yokozuna against Razor Ramon and the 1-2-3 Kid, all while Hunter Hearst Helmsley was picking up a win over Fatu, Goldust was defeating Marty Jannetty, and King Mabel and Yokozuna went to a double countout. In fact, aside from the main event, the only other thing of relevance that would come from the show at all would be Razor Ramon pulling double duty to end the very brief Intercontinental title reign of Dean Douglas. But wait, wasn't Shawn Michaels the Intercontinental Champion? Well, yes, but after getting into a bar fight with a number of Marines in the weeks leading up to the show, he'd end up getting hurt bad enough to where he wouldn't be cleared to wrestle for a while, allowing him to drop the strap without actually being pinned. And this method of losing titles would be a repeating pattern for HBK over the next couple of years as it happened, something which would cause his boss no end of headaches. Still, so talented was he that McMahon had by then decided he should be his next top star anyway, with him from there beginning to make plans to have him achieve his boyhood dream at the next year's WrestleMania. Before we would get there, though, Alundra Blaze would win back the women's title from Bertha Faye the next night on Raw. Then, following this, Survivor Series would come on November 19th, with that show once again largely being made up of a number of 4-on-4 elimination matches, none of which really held any importance in the grand scheme of things. No, the only real notable bout of this show was the main event one, as it was there that Bret Hart would challenge Diesel for the WWF title, taking Big Daddy Cool to his limits and finally giving him a great match he could hang his hat on. Come the end of the day, though, it would be the Hitman who would pick up the win, putting the run of Kevin Nash to bed and starting his third reign on top as WWF champion. But this wasn't a sign that Vince McMahon had decided to go with Bret again, as he'd end up acting as a transitional champion instead, keeping the belt warm until next spring, when the man who would go on to become a bitter enemy, both on screen and in real life, would finally get the better of him. And aside from Bret's big win, the other notable thing that came out of the match was Diesel's soft heel turn following his loss, something which instantly gave him back some of the cool factor he'd originally had, as he became the first person to flip someone off on WWF TV. Yes, maybe if the boss had allowed him to be this person during his reign and not try to turn him into a budget Hulk Hogan, things would have been much different. But that couldn't be changed now, and so the company pressed on as they prepared for their final pay-per-view of the year. Before this would happen, though, Alundra Blaze would shock the wrestling world when she followed Lex Luger in jumping ship to WCW on December 13th. What made her defection different, though, was that when she did this, she was still in possession of the WWF Women's title, leading her to take it with her and actually dump it in the trash live on Nitro. Yes, this was certainly a black eye for Vince McMahon and a sign that his competition was gaining more and more momentum, something that would get worse over the next 12 months. So in retaliation, he'd choose to deactivate the belt entirely, leaving the company without a real women's division for the next few years. And after that, it was full steam ahead for In Your House 5 Seasons Beatings on December 17th, where, while Razor Ramon was dealing with the recent betrayal he'd undergone from the 1-2-3 Kid in a tag match that saw the former team with Marty Jannetty and the latter team with Psycho Sid, their clique buddy Hunter Hearst Helmsley would continue his rise up the ranks with a win over Henry O. Godwin in an Arkansas hog pen match. Elsewhere, Jerry Lawler would welcome Jeff Jarrett back to the company after presenting him with a kayfabe gold record for all his supposed album sales, and after that, the villainous Santa Claus would make his debut by laying out Savio Vega. Yes, it was a stupid gimmick amongst an era that would have many of them, but at least the main event scene didn't have to worry about this, as in the WWF title match later that night, Bret Hart would successfully defend his newly won belt against the British Bulldog in a rematch from their famous bout at Wembley Stadium 3 years prior. And while this one wouldn't be on that level, it would prove to be a step up in match quality from Diesel's run as champ, as Bret continued to excellently execute on a nightly basis. So being able to end 1995 with a slight bit of upward momentum must have felt like a win for the WWF then, especially given how rough of a year it had been. But as it happened, there was one more notable thing that took place this month, one that, while no one realized it at the time, would have major implications for the company's future. Yes, on December 18th, an episode of Raw was taped, and while this episode wouldn't air on TV until the following January, it let the live crowd get introduced to a new signing, the Ringmaster, the very man who would later morph into Stone Cold Steve Austin and carry the company towards unforeseen levels of success. But we'll get there in a couple of years. That's right, even if it had been a pretty terrible year for WWF both creatively and financially, arguably the worst in their entire history in fact, their future was ultimately secure. Before they would be able to stabilize fully, though, 1996 would see some more rough times ahead, as with the Monday Night Wars continuing to get more and more intense every week, the backstage problems that Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels started to have with each other, and another exodus of top talent still to come, Vince McMahon's headaches would be far from over. Ultimately, though, that's a story for another day. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.